I get the pleasure of inviting Tom to come up and chat with us about conflicts and dilemmas. And he's my boss, which is everybody's. I'll give you some dollars later if you on your way out. But it's just been awesome to work under Tom, and when this topic was coming up and we were looking for a speaker, I thought Tom would be a great opportunity to speak with us because of the way that he carries his business. And it's amazing to be in a place where a company is above reproach when they're doing things to protect themselves. And that is really kind of a good way to see business when you start to go, they have these checks and balances in place to make sure they keep themselves above reproach because they are, in some ways, keeping other people above reproach. So I found that to be a really amazing company to work for, and I hope to have a solution to my flooring problem. Come on up.
It's always intriguing when I get an opportunity to talk about ethics and decision making. And let me fill you in a little bit on my background just so you have a sense of the world I come from. I'm a CPA in public practice. I've been in public accounting for 34 years. I've been in larger firm environments for about 12 years. In that large firm environment, I was moving up. I was getting close to becoming a partner. And in that process of almost becoming a partner, the owners of the firm said they wanted me to buy in, which I thought was a great thing. I thought their price was a little high. I thought these guys are nuts. But the biggest thing that struck me was they wanted me to spend more time than I was already spending. And how this came out was I asked one day, I said, do you mind if I leave early on Tuesdays and Thursdays to coach my kids' Little League team? And they said, you can't do that because there's too much work for you to do. And I said, look, I'll get my charge hours in. I'll do the work. I'll be here Saturdays, whatever it takes to get the work done. But I'd like to be able to spend that time with my kids. And they said, no, you can't. And I, of course, being the mildly passive-aggressive sort that I am, I said, great. So on my calendar, every day, Tuesdays and Thursdays, I had client meetings from 3 o'clock on. I was out coaching Little League. But in that process, I decided, I'm not sure these are the people I want to work for. So 22 some odd years ago, I jumped ship and formed my own practice with two gentlemen that I respect highly, and we'll talk a little bit about their interplay in my life a little bit later. But in that process of starting my own business, I decided that as I'm out doing what I'm doing, I want to make sure that I'm doing what I do well. I'd like to make sure that we do things, a product that goes out the door can be as right as possible. And when you're dealing with the world of numbers, you're dealing with moving targets, changing IRS code, and let alone regulation, oftentimes that's hard to do, but we try to do as good a job as we can. And in that process, we do struggle with what is the right thing to do. The flip side to my business world is my volunteer world. I've been heavily involved with the Washington Society of CPAs and the American Institute of Certified Public Accountants, both professional organizations. One of the roles I fulfilled with the American Institute of CPAs was on a senior standard setting body for CPAs nationally, and that's called the Professional Ethics Executive Committee, and it's an organization that actually drafts the code of conduct that CPAs have to comply with. So in my work world, I now get to write standards that impact how I do what I do. And then about 4 years ago, I got appointed by the governor to the State Board of Accountancy, so now I put on a regulatory hat, which is very different from just the work world hat that I have on. To give you an example, I had to take an ethics course through the state of Washington, and I learned, much to my chagrin, that a state employee cannot accept a delivery of something from Amazon.com at their office because that's a misuse of government resources. And I kind of scratched my head and said, what are you talking about? And they said, well, it takes the secretary's time to accept the box and put it on your desk. That's the misuse of resources. So in that process, in a regulatory role, in a standard setting role, and then in my workday life, I see this world of decision-making very differently because I have to put on different hats. And sometimes that affects all of us, and when we're out there doing what we're doing is, what hat do I have on today, and how does that impact my decision-making process, or should it impact my decision-making process? And I also realized in talking to the table mates here about a little bit of how do you make decisions, I realized I'm not sure I can share anything more than these wonderful men have already commented about how they make decisions. So we'll talk a little bit here this morning just about some of the things that I've observed, and in particular in my regulatory role, watching people struggle with ethical conundrums. And oftentimes I look at this decision-making process as just that. How do I approach an issue? What am I supposed to do? What's the outcome going to be? And how do I play that out to its end? So a couple just interesting, from my standpoint, things to think about when we're looking at that ethical decision-making process. Because oftentimes we come to an issue and we say, is this something that's just merely good or bad? Is it right or wrong? And that's a very simplistic way to look at a question. Well, if I do this, it's good. If I don't do that, it's bad. But the most important thing, and I struggle with this when I'm talking with accountants, because I get calls, not quite weekly, but probably about every other week from CPAs around the state of Washington and sometimes from other states, because they're struggling with what our rules say under state rule and law and regulation, as well as our code of conduct. And they're trying to figure out, and they say, if I do this, I think that's the right thing to do. And so I always try to talk them through the process of, how did you start? And so one of the things you need to think about, that I would encourage you to think about, is when you're faced with that dilemma, you're on the horns of that issue, is what's the process you go through? How do you determine where to start? It can be biblically based. That's perfectly allowable. It can be rules and regulation, which is a lot of what Jeff and I work in. It can be just something how you were trained, mom and dad, how they raised you, church, Boy Scouts, you name it. You're coming into this decision-making process with some methodology to approach the question. And that's good, because at least that gives you a benchmark. But the difficulty oftentimes is that enough? Is that enough to help me make the decision? And what's the outcome? Because one of the things we have to face, I think, and be willing to recognize is the situation that I'm looking at a rules-based issue, or is it a principles-based issue? And a lot of what we work in, Jeff and I, there's a rule. I mean, you can do this, you can't do that. But one thing I've seen over the last 13 years in particular, changes in state rule and regulation and law, as well as at the code of conduct level for CPAs, the world I work within, there's been a move from the bright line test of, if you do this, it's correct. If you do this, it's incorrect, to more of a principles-based approach. You need to think about these issues and make a decision. That's all well and good, but when I'm looking at even a small group here, that question of, what's the principle underlying the issue that I'm facing, and how do I approach it? Because John and I, we may approach things very differently. You may approach it from this direction, I may approach it from this direction. We may ultimately get to the same answer, but we may not. And in that process, my decision may be okay. You may look at that and say, that's totally whacked, totally incorrect. And I may look at your decision and go, he's nuts, he's going the wrong direction. And so sometimes that process is something we need to be willing to think about. So I think it's important, just as a process when you're going through that decision-making, idea is what's the issue? First, you got to identify what that issue is, and that's really important and critical, because if you can't figure out what the issue is, it's hard to figure out where do I go. The second component, I think that is critical here is, so not only do I have an issue, but who are the affected parties? Because more often than not, I'm faced with something and it's just going to impact me. It's just a direct one-on-one situation, or at least that's how I view it. So I narrow it down because that can make the decision-making quite a bit easier. But I think sometimes it's important for us to broaden our scope, to use a wide-angle lens, if you will, to say, is what I'm about to do potentially going to impact others that I may or may not see right now, and could that potentially change my decision-making process? For example, I ran into this one day, this is a few years back, my college-age daughter, she's out of college now, thank goodness, I don't have to pay tuition anymore, but she and I were at a store, and the clerk, I was paying cash for something, and the clerk gave me my change. It should have been like 2 ones and some change, and I got a 20 and a 1, and I'm sitting there looking at the money, I'm going, this person just gave me the wrong amount of cash. So we get to deal with an ethical dilemma, small one, but it's a very real one. And my daughter was sitting there staring at the money, and I thought, I just made 20 bucks. That's the first thought that goes to your head, and it's like, no, wait a minute, that's not correct, because this poor clerk is going to get somehow rung up incorrectly because she's going to have to reconcile her till, but I've got my daughter staring at this thing too. And so when I pointed this out to the clerk, they were stunned to begin with. It's like, hey, stupid, why didn't you keep the money? I could see that look in her eyes. But my point was, it's not my money. This is your money. And so I think oftentimes in that decision-making process, we really do have to look beyond ourselves and say, can I have an impact in what I'm about to do that might help somebody else make a correct decision or a better decision down the road? And that's one of the dilemmas we face, because oftentimes that decision is not the right decision. It's one of many options that we have to face. And so that's something that I think we need to be willing to deal with. Another example I would use there, and it's in a bigger sense, because one of the real important issues I see in decision-making processes is how do the dollars of a given situation affect or change that decision-making process. And that's a really important one, because that gets to that, what's your value, what's your moral base, what's the right thing to do. I was working with a client who was working on selling their business, and so we were reviewing the buy-sell agreement, the underlying contract in place, and how the contract was the dollar amounts for the contract were to be calculated. So this drove right to how much money was my client going to get for the sale of their business. And one of the things I've enjoyed in the 30-plus years of being in this crazy CPA business is working with attorneys. They're fun to work with sometimes. They're exasperating at the same time. But in looking at the agreements that had been drafted and agreed upon by both parties, and this is one of those little picky accounting things, but they determined how to calculate the purchase price and the price that my client was to receive, but the accounting methodology that they had chosen inside the contract was incorrect. It was not in line with the intent of the parties. And I picked up on this, and I thought, my client's going to pick up a very large this is about a six-figure increase in the amount of money that they can receive because of how the contract was written. They could have been, to use another expression, but the one that fits, they could have been a hard ass and said, everybody signed this contract. This is what's in play. Regardless of our intent, you owe me more money than what was originally agreed upon. And so in talking with the client, it's a chance to interact with them and say, is that what you really want to do? And they said, no, really, my intent was the lower price based on a different methodology. We had both sides amend the agreement, redraft it, and everybody kind of went away happy. The attorney I was working with was a little chagrined that you didn't make more money for your client. I said, that's correct, but at the end of the day, that was the correct thing to do. So, I see those in business, but we face those types of dilemmas just day to day when we're out there doing what we're doing. And so, as I was thinking about this morning, how do we discuss this topic of decision making? Sometimes I think it's important to look at what are some of the things that impact the process. So when I look at my own decision-making processes, I look at it from the standpoint of what are the things that I rely on to help inform that decision. I've been attending church at Bethany Community Church for 36 years, been a member there, and so my faith background really does come into play and helps kind of control that process, if you will. But as I shared at our table, I said oftentimes God provides me with 5 doors to pick. He says, you got to pick one to step through. And I'm not going to tell you which one, by the way. So you got to pick one. But just follow me as you go. And so that's kind of how I've always looked at it, is make sure I'm trying to keep that connection close so that I'm hopefully making a correct decision. But it's not just as simple as a what would Jesus do kind of question. That's kind of trite, if you will, at a level, because it's just not that straightforward. We're often faced with stuff that is very complicated, very difficult, and we have to wend our way through that process. When you look at the accounting world that I work in, I've got a code of conduct. I've got rules of conduct that I have to follow, and they really help box me in, which, to be honest with you, is really kind of nice, because it makes things somewhat simple. But for that average person that doesn't work in that world, where does this stuff come from? If you look at the golden rule, the golden rule is really any basic principle that you would follow to ensure success. That's kind of the general definition of what a golden rule is. Okay, so what is the golden rule? I have no idea. If you look at the biblical side of it, do unto others as you would have them do unto you. Okay, that's, out of Matthew, that's a great mantra also, but that doesn't necessarily solve our problem when you're out there doing what you're doing. And so I think we've got to be willing to think further through what the issue. Like I mentioned earlier, how were you raised? How did school impact it? How does the organizations you're involved with help affect or change that decision-making process? And so I think it's very important to realize that we're not necessarily just in a vacuum. We really are trying to look out. We should, I think, look out and say, how do I deal with this? Do you go to others for help? That's one thing I think is a really important component. And I think of something like this group here, is you've got a group of people that hopefully if you build some trust with, you can call somebody up and say, I'm stuck. I've got these issues that I'm facing and I'm not sure what the right course of action is. Now, I couldn't tell one of you what to do, but I might help you talk through that type of thing. Like I say, I get calls from CPAs all the time on that very topic. How do I wend my way through the issues that I'm facing? One thing I do see often, though, and this is in particular, I kind of have to relate it back to the world I work within, I see how life impacts the decision-making process. And how do I define life? Life can be just about anything that comes up. It comes up, like for you, a job change. Now now I'm out of work and I'm hunting for work. It's like, well, that's great for a period of time, especially if you've got some resources to carry you through, but pretty soon it might start getting a little tight and it might change, how do I decide how I move forward, how do I pay the bills, etc. That's not easy stuff. But life could also be, heck, I just have cancer. I have a relative who's got cancer and is going to pass away. 12 years ago, I had life kind of kick me in the teeth in spades. It was a year process where I had my dad die, my mom got cancer, my mom died, my wife got cancer, she didn't die, thank goodness. The dog died, and then my basement flooded. So it was this really weird series of events, and thankfully I've got two wonderful business partners who were able to kind of just come alongside and kind of help me make sure that no major piece of pottery fell off the table and broke. So life can come into the process and really change that decision-making process for you, because it really can impact. You could have a situation that occurs where, shoot, all of a sudden I have a health event pop up. And this health event now costs a lot of money that's not covered. How am I going to deal with that? Do I have a lifestyle that maybe is bigger than what my monetary income is? Just to give you an example, I had to deal with a case from the Board of Accountancy here just this week, and I brought the case home, and I brought up just a fraction of the case file with me, and so I'm reviewing a complaint against a CPA, and I'm watching a situation where I have a husband and wife who are divorcing. The CPA did some work for that couple, didn't identify what the real underlying code of conduct ethics issue was, and kept doing the work. Should not have done the work, needless to say. But the sad part was watching an email string between this divorcing husband and the divorcing wife, absolute train wreck of a couple, and the words that were used back and forth. I mean, it was, if it hadn't been so funny at a level, I'd have cried over the situation, because you're watching a family become torn apart, and in the middle of this, I have to assess the behavior of a CPA who made a wrong decision. And so that's my role in my regulatory world. But I was watching life affect a couple in an email string. And when I see this email string going back and forth, moron, don't ever email me again. And it got much worse than that. And my wife said, what are you chuckling about? I said, this could be us in any other given situation, and there but by the grace of God go I. So it was interesting to see how the CPA responded in that setting. But life had impacted that situation. And so that's one thing that I would just encourage each of you to think about, is as you go through your day-to-day stuff. But at the same time, if you have those moments where you can pop off a call, that's helpful. But hopefully as you work through, what is your process for making a decision? Because ultimately each of us has to develop our own approach to a given situation, and it's going to be different than how somebody else might do it. But hopefully you've got that in the back of your head, because that'll provide at least a baseline to approach the situation. And so I think it's important to ask ourselves those questions as we look at maybe asking help from others. Because I can look at a situation and go, I'm going to do this, I'm going to go on, and it'll be fine. But I find myself more and more, and maybe age does something to this, is asking myself the question, is what I'm about to do the right or the wrong thing? And is what I'm about to do going to adversely affect other parties? Or if I don't have a good answer to that, what are the ultimate outcomes that could happen to these other folks in this decision-making process or to myself? Is this decision going to cost me money? Should that monetary impact change that decision process? Because often things they're either right or wrong, regardless of the dollars involved. And so I think those are important parts of that decision-making process to think about. And so as I look at a group like you gentlemen here, and Elisa, welcome, is how do you guys approach that process? And how, and in particular, how does money come into play? I thought, as I was working on this brief talk and realizing I'm talking to people that are probably a lot smarter than I am in some respects, I thought, it might be fun to put you guys into a little bit of a role play, which I know usually attendants to courses, they hate role playing and they hate getting into conversation, but we're going to give it a try. So what I'm going to do is try to, let's see here, can I take 3 of you from that table and put you over here? They're looking at each other like, who's going to move first? So let's move 3 of you over there. I'm going to try to put you into a situation at your tables where you'll have 2 people who will have a role they have to play. And I'll hand out cards to the table. When you get your role card, you have about 30 seconds to look at your role and to remember that that's your role that you have to play. The other people at the table, in this case we might have 2 people at the table, you're going to be the observer of an interaction between 2 others, and I'd like you to watch how that goes. So you'll have about 30 seconds to figure out your role. We'll give you a few minutes to talk through what your role is and what that interaction is between the 2 people with the cards, and then we'll come back together and talk about what you saw. Sometimes it's the easiest way to deal with that decision-making process, because oftentimes the other side of this coin is we get to watch decisions happen and we get to watch them occur. And sometimes in that process we have the ability to be the person who can interject a little bit into it or to provide some wisdom or counsel along the way. So you who are observers will get to watch what transpires at the table. So I don't know if this is going to work, but we're going to give it a shot. It may totally fall on its face, but if it does, it does. So there you go. So let's give this a shot. Let me see here. We have Jim and June Smith. Whoops. And then we have Bob or Helen Jones. You get to be June. You get to be Helen. Or you can pick whichever gender you prefer. Not a problem. One for you. And you can't really tell the other what your role is. You just have to play this out, which makes this even more of a challenge, if you will. Yep. Goody, we're gonna. Okay, green. Okay, so 30 seconds. Go. Read. Figure out how you're going to do what you do. John, I'm going to let you cheat and see both.
Oh, wonderful. Thank you. Cheating's legal in this country?
It is. I get to call the rules, right?
I have your permission, so it's right.
Yeah, exactly. Okay, so for those of you who are observers, I'll give you a little brief intro here. You have Jim or June Smith, who is an investor, is looking to get a new broker. And then you have Bob or Helen Jones, depending, I had to cover both genders just in case, who's the investment advisor or broker. And so with this, what I'd like each table to do is kind of enter into the conversation. So at each table, you've got the investor who's looking for a new broker. Okay? And with that, I'd like Bob or Helen Jones to start out and kind of talk about the services and products that they might like to sell. Ian, how about you? What'd you see over there?
I don't think Cliff is capable of not being integritous. He could have done it. And he did. I mean, he was doing a nice soft sell, but he was very upfront about, I got the point. He was asking about management fees, and he says, well, here's some options. I can sell you this and this. So he was coming in with a negotiation, and he revealed, I'll make more money if you buy the risky thing. But, we could put part of it in risk and part of it in conservative and things like that. So he was candid about that sort of things, and it didn't seem to be offending June here.
Okay. How about you?
You know, I obviously didn't get to see these beforehand, but
Right.
I'm sitting here and my first concept was, these guys are at polar opposites.
Uh-huh.
I got a guy here that's looking to develop a relationship first, and a guy here that's looking to sell first.
Uh-huh.
And it's well, let's see how this works out, and he got fired. Yeah.
So how about those of you who were the investor here, Jim or June? Jeff, how did you feel about the sales process?
Well, I felt that, I was trying to bring up as many questions as I could and where I was going, and my broker was started to trail off a little bit at the end when he started mentioning about opportunities in Africa, which was, there's always been opportunity in Africa.
Yeah, I got that email too.
Was it Nigeria?
Gary, how about you? How did you feel in this situation?
How did I feel?
Yeah, because I'm not sure Tim did a good enough job here. We got to teach him role playing. Yeah, there you go.
Yeah, I've been around people like him before.
You gotta watch out for John,
Yeah, brought out a new side of him I wasn't aware of.
Yeah.
But
You could just see Gary change, just like who he went from. I might be able to actually trust this guy to no way, like I'm not going anywhere near it. So.
yeah, no, I felt it was he did a good job answering the questions. I know he had to be careful what he said.
How about over here? As the investor.
As an investor, again, he was focused on the result he wanted, and that was fairly obvious to me that there was an agenda there, and I was looking for trust and more of a long-term situation.
Mm-hmm. How about here?
Well,
Cliff may not have done a good enough job being a weasel, if you will. So.
Right. I felt that I was certainly not up against a professional salesperson in this arena. However, I felt that he was very, very evenly giving me advice on both areas.
Okay.
Was not pushy at all. Was not asking questions that we would normally ask in the field, but a few, and I guess it was just so new to both of us. But basically, I felt he just very even approach. You can do this or this, and here's the consequences of both.
Yeah, and like I said, when I set this thing up originally, I wasn't sure how this would work, but my goal was to try to give you a little bit of a sense of you have two people on either ends of a situation, and what's motivating one on one side may not be known to the other side. And so that process that you go through to how do I make the right decision gave you that one intentionally. I just had to. I couldn't resist.
I'll tell you, that was uncomfortable for me to be put in that position.
Uh-huh.
And so what I did is I didn't go with the limited natural gas option.
You didn't play the role.
But I did go with another high commission
Okay.
product, an annuity.
Okay.
But it was a product that I felt met
Might fit better.
George's right objective, right?
So-
So-
Totally disagree with that.
Yeah.
So we need to work with Tim on role playing here. But this was, again, just to maybe give you a little bit of an idea of sometimes what's underneath that process when you're either in a sales role or receiving information from the other. One of the things that I work with my young staff with, in particular on the audit side, the tax side's a little bit different because we have a little bit different set of rules. But one of the things I always try to encourage my young people is ask lots of questions and try to have as clean a slate as possible. Don't go in with necessarily preconceived notions, because I'm trying to teach them get as much information as you can, because information is a great tool to help you in that process of decision making. With the tax side, it's a little bit different because we have different rules that we have to comply with. But again, it's lots of question asking and trying to figure out where do we go.
Can I ask one question, John?
Just got one more minute, Tom.
Okay.
Yeah.
So you've got an S corp, and you want to figure out how much income distribution to take from the client side and the accountant side, and it is not clear how much you can take. And so the accountant's more aggressive and takes out more, and then he gets an audit because he took out a higher within bounds. And when you get into the fuzzy stuff like that, how do you make decisions, ethical and legal decisions, without
Sure.
getting audited?
When we're faced with those kind of situations, one of the things we really try to assess is what are the underlying rules? Are there set rules in place, or by default inside the IRS code, for example, do I have just one giant gray area? And oftentimes in that S-Corp example is a really good one, because what that person takes out as a wage or a distribution, there are no set rules. It's reasonable compensation is the IRS terminology. And so in that setting, we try to advise the client, if you do this, if you take a lower wage and a higher distribution, your risk on audit is this. And so we try to inform them, here's the downside to making that choice. If they want to get so aggressive, I make a decision then, can I sign that tax return? Because that's back on me then, is that reasonable? And so we try to tell our clients very upfront that you have a range of choices here, but outside of those range, and to use a golf analogy, I gave up golf a long time ago because I suck at golf. But I want to try to keep it relatively in the fairway, maybe in the fringe a little bit, but when I'm back in the trees, nobody's going to benefit in that setting. So again, I didn't know if this was work. I thought it would be a fun example to try, but more than anything is to get us involved in that process of how do you receive information, how do you sell the information. Nice job on the annuities. I hadn't thought about that, but that just gives you a little bit of sense. So hopefully that has some value for you, and you get to take away something at least about the process. It's not easy. In my personal opinion, oftentimes decision making is just that. It's a bit of a conundrum. So something to think about.